Welcome to the Journey Podcast. I am your host, Josh Valentin, and here at the Journey Podcast, we actually capture some of the most incredible, inspiring stories and the life lessons that came along the way. Today, I have the honor and privilege of interviewing someone who I actually met at our recent creator conference, and she is absolutely dynamic. And Priscilla Maria, of course, we're bringing on, who is a certified, she's a certified trauma recovery coach. She is a mental health expert and an advocate for recovery and mental health. And I can't think of a better person to bring on to the Journey Podcast to kind of geek out about some of these concepts regarding trauma and healing. And the founder of the Cycle Breakers Club and so much more, public speaker, and just an overall vibe and phenomenal woman, Miss Priscilla Maria. Thank you so much for being on.
Thank you so
Pleasure
much.
having you on the show.
Thank you so much for that introduction and just having me on this platform.
Yes, absolutely. So,
Yes.
wow, we can start off in so many directions here, and I really want you to kind of go back. We always start off the show with taking it back to the very beginning, because the line of work that you're in today is pretty much it's sort of like a culmination of your life experiences that sort of led to the work that you're doing today. It obviously didn't start there in your childhood.
Yeah.
And I would love to hear a little bit about, how your life started, and a little bit about your childhood, where you're from, and
Okay.
a little bit of your upbringing.
All right. So I like to say that my story starts before I was even born. So trauma, different things I struggled with were already in my history. So for example, me being born in the United States was a result of trauma that my parents experienced. So my mother's from Ecuador, and she was taken here via parental kidnapping, so not by choice. My father is a refugee from Nicaragua, and so he had to flee for his life. So again, not by choice. And then they met in Los Angeles. They had my brother and myself. And when you take two trauma survivors and they come together with a lot of unresolved trauma, that trauma is going to transmit to the next generation.
Yeah.
And so I was born and raised in the States, but I moved around my whole life. So I know you're from New York. I can't relate to that. Like when people ask me where you're from, I really don't know where to start, because I was born in Michigan, but I lived in California, Maryland, Pennsylvania, Connecticut, Michigan, and now Florida. And that also was a result of my immigrant parents trying to make the best out of their situation.
For sure. No, it's incredible. And I remember learning my own studies on trauma, which I oftentimes talk a lot about. We oftentimes share how trauma can be passed down through genetics as well. What have your studies led you to? As a certified trauma recovery coach, you've obviously studied how trauma gets passed down through generations. Like, what's your knowledge in terms of how it actually gets passed down?
Yeah, so a great book is by Mark Wallen. I believe It Didn't Start With You. And he really breaks down the science. So, at a cellular level, like what happens? What is epigenetics? But for me, I have a lot of anecdotal evidence. So I can just look at my family and see, okay, there is a pathology of sexual abuse on my mom's side. There is a pathology of alcohol abuse on both sides. And domestic violence and all these things. And that's part of the reason I came into this field, was because I had a lot of questions. Like, why does this keep happening? And it didn't stop with my parents. I saw it with my own relationships, with my own decisions, that, okay, there's something to this, that there is something beyond just me that is factoring into this.
Yeah. For sure. I'm curious, right? Because you grew up, if I'm not mistaken, in a two-parent household
I
the
did.
entire time. And that comes with a certain degree of structure and security, and sort of minimizes, not all the time, but in many cases, it minimizes a lot of the trauma that's related to, let's say, abandonment and neglect.
Yeah.
If you have a two-parent household, you're less likely to encounter that, unless, obviously, if your parents are abusive or workaholics or so on and so forth. In your case, what was your experience like? Even if you scratch out the epigenetics and trauma being passed on, what was your experience in terms of what you actually encountered growing up?
So it's interesting you say that, because I did have my parents together for my whole life, basically up until my 30s, where they are now divorced. And one of the reasons that they stayed together was because their parents divorced. And so they tried really hard to break that cycle.
Yeah.
But as far as, just to get clarity around the question, are you saying like what cycle specifically I saw growing up?
Like, how was it? Was it a loving and nurturing
Okay.
environment? Like, did you have to, let's just say, recover from actual things that you encountered? Because, based off of what you said, you were essentially born into, let's say, a family that had to endure deep trauma. And I kind of want to make the correlation between, like, okay, like trauma that comes from the genetic level, like generational
Yeah.
cycles, as opposed to actual encounters that
Got you.
happen throughout your childhood.
Yes. So when it comes to that question, even just my first response is to be very protective and say, okay, what do I say?
Of course.
What I will say is that I have one brother, and his experience, even though we're in the same household, same parents, was completely different than mine.
Absolutely.
And so you're Hispanic as well, and in our culture, for many of us, that looks like men and boys are treated way differently than
Absolutely.
girls and women.
Yeah.
And so some of the trauma that I observed was the discipline that my brother received. And it was abusive, straight up. And when I came to find out, because at this point, I'm an adult. So I've had a lot of candid conversations with my family members.
Of course.
And I learned that for my father and my uncles, that was like an upgrade. So for Yvonne to experience the physical abuse that he did, okay, but it wasn't being whipped. It wasn't being whipped with a leather whip. It wasn't some of the things that they went through. So in their mind, it was okay.
Yeah.
Apart from that, I would say my parents definitely did their best. And a lot of my trauma was from relatives. So one of the most influential traumas was my molestation as a little girl. And that was from my grandfather, my mom's father. And I didn't know until I was like 28 that he was a serial pedophile.
Oh, wow.
So he had molested multiple cousins, molested or attempted to molest multiple aunts, and everyone knew.
Yeah.
Everyone knew. They knew that he was taken away by CPS in Los Angeles.
Wow.
And when he was taken away, he came to our apartment in the Bay in California.
Wow.
And no one told us about CPS. No one told us about really who he was. And so, unsurprisingly, I was molested, and other cousins of mine in the Bay were also molested.
Wow. Was he an alcoholic?
He was.
Yeah. It's interesting. I had a similar situation in my family, and we ended up finding out years later that this was going on, and alcohol was very well deeply rooted in a lot of those things. And, it's so sad to see, because I always do my best to look at people from the lens of, this was once an innocent little 5-year-old boy playing in a sandbox or something like that. And unfortunately, they kind of grow up to become these monsters in a sense, and it's not to villainize per se, but many times I see like the influence of drugs and alcohol. And, in our culture, sometimes you hear a religious person may say, it's called spirits for a reason, right? Because you kind of, bring out these dark energies, if you will. And I believe in that in the sense of not like an actual spirit per se, but the very dark aspects of our nature that sort of comes out as an influence of being, drunk, and unfortunately drunk around, children. And it's not an excuse. But it is very, very unfortunate to see that. And oftentimes I do see the correlation, especially if they're on some kind of drugs or alcohol influence, So in terms of dealing with it, do you feel like it affected you throughout like childhood, or was it something that like later on you started to realize just based on your personal relationships?
Yeah, so it happened more than once, and those molestations had a profound impact on everything. Like, to be honest with you, anytime that I'm alone with men that I don't know, I get nervous because if your own grandfather violates you, then the bar is pretty low that, well, why wouldn't this person do something? And so what happened was around 10 years old, I told one of my elders, and I was like, hey, because I was actually taught, don't let anybody touch you, let us know.
Of course.
So I did that. But I guess the asterisk was, if they're a family member, then we may act a little differently. And so unfortunately, nothing was done. I was told the next day, verbatim, that was not molestation, and it was never talked about again. Like, that was it. And so I felt a sense of relief that, oh, okay, false alarm, I'm 10 years old.
Yeah.
But once he passed when I was 13, it's like something woke up in me. And I'm a little bit older. I can understand more about sex and what's not appropriate. And I, started to kind of come back to me. But this elder said that it wasn't. So maybe I'm just tripping. Like, I'm gaslighting myself. And I really kept it hidden for a very long time until I was forced to disclose it when I was a teenager.
Yeah.
When I was 19, I went to a wilderness program in Utah. And for those who may not know, it's a very controversial program where you go out in the desert and you literally live off the land and like outside. And one thing they made me do was tell my parents and tell my brother that I was molested. And I wasn't ready to say it like that, how they told me to say it, but I didn't have a choice. And after that came out another time, eventually that led to acceptance from my parents. And it felt like I was molested for the first time at 19, when I actually had it verified and confirmed by other people. And one of the reasons I ended up in a Utah desert was because of my behavior. I was very angry at men for most of college, for a long time. It looked like drinking. So I can talk about my grandfathers all I want, but at the end of the day, I was also a binge drinker. I also fell into that trap. So did my brother.
For sure.
And so my behaviors in Baltimore when I was going to school, they started to concern me. And my parents didn't know what I was getting into, but they knew enough to know that, okay, she needs to...
For sure.
We need to look at her.
Yeah. So you mentioned Baltimore. Like, how does that tie into the story? What did you go to Baltimore for?
For college. So I went to Johns Hopkins, and I worked really hard to get into that school. I went to 4 different high schools because all the moving. So you can imagine how hard it is to get into a top school, let alone when you're moving so much and life is a bit hectic. But once I got there, I had a different agenda, I guess. As I was checking into my dorm, my brother was checking into his first rehab. And so we had just came to find out about his addiction. And that was very scary. We didn't even grow up with alcohol in the house because of my grandfathers. My mom grew up in a bar in Ecuador.
Yeah.
So very anti-alcohol.
For sure.
But I was the one who went into his room. I was tasked with going into his room and taking inventory of all the pills, all the bottles. And so needless to say, I went into college really scared and also very resentful.
Yeah. That's interesting. You mentioned all the moving. Why was there so much moving? Was it like, a military family situation? Usually when you hear a lot of moving, it's like because of families moving from military base to military base. In your case, why was that?
I usually get that response, but I've come to realize it really wasn't that necessary. But growing up, we were taught that it was necessary. So going back to my father, because of his traumatic upbringing, escaping warfare, I'm talking about AK-47s, trying to kill him, machete, a lot of horrific things. He was super ambitious. He is super ambitious. And so we were raised from day one, you're going to a top school. You have to get an education. And so apart from him not wanting us to grow up in Los Angeles, because that's where, they kind of settled in, they're like, we want you to go to the best schools. We want you to go to live in areas where you don't have to see what we saw growing up. And so it was a combination of that and also him being ambitious and wanting to climb the corporate ladder. Like, okay, I got to move here because I'll make more money here. Da 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 da. And so, but it wasn't necessary. It was a bit much.
Yes,
now that I'm older, I can see.
Only imagine.
Yeah.
So what did your parents do for a living?
So my mother she was and has been a homemaker.
Nice.
And then my father, he works, is probably top 5 in the world company, and he's executive.
Got it. That's amazing.
Yeah.
So I'm so curious, right? Because here we have a first generation, immigrant family in a sense, where your parents were the first ones to migrate over, and then you guys are first generation Americans, right? And you have the mother and father figures. You have, I would assume, a strong value system, and you have a hardworking father, disciplined father, and then you have your mom who's a homemaker. I'm really trying to figure out, okay, what went wrong?
Right. Yeah.
What went wrong? Because you have your scenario, but was it just that? Right, that kind of led to all of the extreme behavior, and then for your brother, right, like why did everything? In terms of why do you believe that he kind of went down that path? And by the way, here on our show, it's never to villainize anyone or point the finger at anyone. It's really just to educate on, especially with our people, like where are we going wrong, or what has happened, so that we can learn from that and grow from that, right? And to prevent other people down the road from having to go through that. But in your case, it's interesting. Like I grew up without my biological father. I grew up in the ghetto. I've seen like a lot of deeply traumatic stuff, but for you, it just seems like it's a completely different, experience. So I'm really curious as to what you think led to that.
Yeah, I've had to reflect on this myself, because I'm like, how do you get 2 kids who went to Catholic school and we were good kids? Like, what happened? But so I can give my interpretation for my brother. I would say definitely the physical abuse. I'll give one example, and trigger warning, of course, for those listening. One of my uncles, for example, it was at a Petco in Pennsylvania, and my brother wasn't, I guess, listening. This man pulled out his leather belt, like straight in Petco in front of everyone, and just started beating him. And when I think about that, I'm like, what the hell was that? Like, were you trying to, like, apart from how wrong it is to hurt a child,
of course, you're
ready to go to prison over what? Like, to catch a case over what? And nobody did anything about that. It's a lot of things that happen that it's like it is what it is. So I would say, and it was more than one family member, so his physical abuse definitely had an effect. I know his upbringing there's still things I'm learning about him. Like, for example, he said when he was a little kid, I don't know if they were gang banging or if they were like for real gang banging, I don't know. But he said when we lived in the Bay, he was jumped, into a little gang. And then I would say the immense amount of pressure that he was placed, because I had always been a high achieving student, very quiet. I didn't want to make any noise. I didn't want to cause any stress to my parents, so I very much kept everything inside. The molestation, the bullying at school, everything. With my brother, he was very much under a microscope. And the standard was not, go to college. It's like, you need to go to Harvard. You need to go to Columbia.
Got it.
And so couple all of that with undiagnosed mental illness.
Of course.
So he, panic disorder, anxiety, OCD.
Yeah. Makes a lot of sense now, for sure. Interesting. How is your brother doing now?
I love my brother. So it's been a journey, to say the least. So right now he has made tremendous progress, but part of my story, and in college specifically, was his traumatic brain injury. So I almost lost him in 2012.
Wow.
Yeah. He was supposed to die. I literally grieved him. Like, it was just a matter of officially pulling the plug.
Wow.
But we went to church, we we were ready to say goodbye.
Wow.
The doctor said there's a 0% chance of recovery and you shouldn't prolong your agony. So you need to take him off.
If you don't mind sharing, like, what exactly happened to
Yeah.
him?
It's hard to answer that even today because Ivan was under the influence when this happened.
Got it.
And so he has no recollection. To
Wow.
him, it's like he took a nap. And 6 months later, he woke up from a coma. And now he can't walk. Now he can't write his name. Now he can't, his arm, he had a lot of spasticity and things like that. What we believe happened was he was intoxicated and he hadn't been taking care of himself. And so when he initially went to the ICU, I mean, his lungs, one was collapsed, his organs were shutting down. He had pneumonia, like walking pneumonia. He had bruises and cuts. One of his hands was like a ball, like it was so swollen. So I don't know what happened, but he definitely was without oxygen. So it wasn't a physical injury; it was just an anoxic brain injury, and it takes minutes for you to die when you're not breathing.
Of course.
So
Yeah.
really bad.
Wow. So is he currently under the care, like, with your family? Okay. Got it.
Yeah.
Got it. Wow. How has that been for the family overall? Like, just dealing with that. I'm sure that's got to be tough, especially for your parents. You know,
Yeah.
their firstborn, right? And their boy at that.
Yeah.
Like, I'm sure that's got to be really, really tough on the family.
It was and I don't think that's something you can ever really recover from.
For sure.
So even like last night, we watched a movie together. So, any type of, time that we spend together is precious at this point. But when he was actively using, that wasn't the case. There was a lot of fighting. There was a lot of arguing.
Yeah.
And so we're in a much healthier place now. But there's like so many layers to it.
For sure.
As to like, the addiction, then the injury,
Of course.
and then the recovery.
Yeah, for sure. Now I'm curious, right? Because you had your season where you sort of were dancing in the dark a little bit, like especially in college, and you sort of became rebellious. What do you feel like it was just the situation with your grandfather, or do you feel like there were other things that ultimately led to that?
I would say that was a big thing. It was also domestic violence that I had experienced. So this loved one, threatened to punch me, spat on me in my face, get like a bottle of water and just pour it, like degrade you, things like that. Chase me, kick me out the car, call me out my name. So I was very angry at that. I was very, very angry at that. I was angry at my grandfather. I was angry at different family members. And so I went into college saying that I wasn't going to drink because I went to my brother's rehab when he got checked in, and you do the family sessions, like, oh shit, I don't want to drink. But that didn't last long. And so for me, what it looked like was, so where Hopkins is, it's like a bubble, the undergraduate campus. But if you go like a little bit over here or a little bit over there, you're in neighborhoods that are a lot more high crime and under-resourced. And so I would go to those neighborhoods a lot. And that's where I would get my alcohol because I never wanted people to see me drunk. I never wanted people to see me act an ass, at least at the beginning. And so that's how I, justified, I could easily go to a frat house or anything or down the hall and get alcohol, but I would put myself in a lot of dangerous situations, a lot of clubbing, a lot of parties, a lot of just putting myself in situations that were very unnecessary and scary. And you mentioned, Gabor Mate, with the reading that I've done around trauma, I realized I was reenacting trauma a lot.
Yeah. Interesting. Like, I'm curious as to what led to you sort of attracting the type of person that you attract, like you said, being degraded in such a way that, I can only imagine if I had a daughter and found out like her boyfriend was just like pouring water over her and degrading her in that way, I'd probably take him out, just off the strength of how disrespectful that is. Do you feel like at an unconscious level you sort of attracted the type of person like that? And it sounds a bit off because your dad wasn't like that per se.
No.
Right? So what do you think kind of led to you attracting someone like that into your life?
So to clarify, my father definitely did not beat on my mom, nothing like that. And then to also clarify, so the man that did that to me was not a romantic partner. But I will give another example where it was a romantic partner. So in college, I dated someone, and this individual did a lot of things, but the worst thing he did was he raped me.
Wow.
Yes. And so when you say attract, I would reframe it to accept, because I don't think I attracted a lot, because I attracted a lot of good people in my life.
Of course.
I think it was I accepted. I accepted him because I felt broken, and I was not open about anything.
Yeah.
So what if anyone was, reasonably accepting of me? It's like, oh, thank you. Thank you for not judging me or not discarding me. And so that led to accepting a lot of unhealthy behaviors.
Wow. Yeah. I love that, because sometimes you have people come into your life and it's just purely coincidence, and you do accept because you may feel sorry for them, or you don't want to just leave them high and dry, and things like that. And it's interesting. I know obviously boundaries and standards and these types of things oftentimes help with these sort of toxic situations or toxic relationships. What are your views on boundaries overall and just having high standards for yourself? Like if you had a daughter, what would you teach her when it comes to just setting the right boundaries, or even their selection process? Like what are some of the red flags, and how do you put boundaries in place to sort of prevent some of these things from happening?
Yeah, that's a great topic, and one that I really love, because now I feel like I know what boundaries are, but growing up, I did not. And as I was working on my book this month, that was a section that I have, is boundaries, because even as a little girl, I didn't know I could say no to people. I didn't know I'd had the option of not greeting someone. You know how with us it's like kiss on the cheek, hug, buenas tardes, ta ta ta. And I think it kind of started with that, this blind allegiance to elders, where you have to respect them, even if your grandfather's an alcoholic, even if he's a pedophile, you still respect him.
Yeah.
And so, and that was just reinforced time and time again. And so even when my brother was dying and in a precarious state, I didn't take any time off of school. I was literally, one day I vomited in the bathroom because I was so stressed out, like uncontrollably. And I passed out a little bit. I was taken by the security from the campus to the wellness center. Like, girl, are you okay?
Yeah.
And, once I kind of like took some Gatorade, took a little nap, I was like, okay, I got to go to the hospital again. And I have to check on my brother. And that's an example of just no boundaries, zero. And so I didn't really know what that was, because with my parents, my mother has a very traumatic childhood, and so she was not taught to really stand up for herself. And then my father, he's very outspoken, but there was a lot of codependency on his side of the family, because, when you have to survive with each other and you're sleeping on floors, you're sleeping in garages, you're transient,
of course,
living where you can live, the family was like super like glued. And so if you did something that was seen as disloyal, or if you weren't contributing a certain amount, is disrespectful.
Yeah.
And so he had to learn boundaries as well. And so that's something that I teach people all the time, is be selfish, put yourself first. You don't need permission to set a boundary. You don't need to explain yourself.
Yeah,
just this is what it is.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's important to just even communicate your boundaries because you can't expect for someone to just know, especially if someone doesn't understand boundaries. Like, one of the things that I study a lot is just on narcissists, right? Because a lot of my clients are females, and just having an understanding of how narcissists utilize like gaslighting techniques and all these different things. And many times narcissists, they don't understand boundaries, and they're overstepping the boundaries, and it's important to communicate these things and draw the line in the sand, like this is not what I'm willing to tolerate.
Yeah.
And unfortunately most people aren't really taught these things going into relationships, and they have people kind of walk all over them and treat them like a doormat in a sense. Even with family, you can get so caught up in family overstepping your boundaries. So it is important to really teach people how to treat you in a sense. So I'm curious, like, while you were in college, you finished, of course,
Yeah.
and you did some law school and studied. What was your topic of study? You mentioned it earlier.
Oh, that's just, so undergrad I had majors, but law school is just a Juris Doctor.
Yeah, exactly. So tell us a little bit about that. Like, were you still kind of in a party phase? Were you just kind of balancing it all, juggling it all? Like
A
you
mess.
were really good at keeping up with your schoolwork,
Yeah.
but just kind of living this double life in a sense.
I was about to say that, yeah, double life.
Yeah.
The same thing at Hopkins. I would volunteer. I graduated with honors, like very much like and that's, it might make sense if I tell you that I am diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. So splitting and, having all these different different ways of behaving makes a lot more sense to me now when I look back. And so in law school, I did not stop with the partying. When I stopped drinking in college, I eventually developed an eating disorder because it's very much similar compulsions, secretive. So I had to go to treatment. So once I started law school, which was about 6 months after I completed treatment, which I should not have done, again, a lack of boundaries.
Yeah, for sure.
I promise, I'm not going to starve myself. I'm not going to restrict. I'm not going to work out hours, a day. But the eating disorder persisted. It just looked differently. So it turned into binge eating disorder, which was a whole different animal. And so the entire time I was in law school, I was battling an eating disorder. I gained a lot of weight. I had a lot of compulsive eating episodes. And then on top of that, I was still going out. And honestly, I'm a very delayed person. So sometimes it takes me years to sit back and be like, what was that? And when I think of my partying at this time, I went to school in California, Southern California, and I started to try to be in certain circles. And I think it stems from the fact of I was seeking validation. So for someone who has experienced sexual trauma throughout their life and has, rape anxiety, you would think I would not want to attract men. But I was doing that. I think I was trying to seek validation, like, oh, I'm good enough or I'm pretty enough. Because I wasn't like that growing up. And so that looked like going to different house parties, studios, clubs. And one of the houses I ended up at, this individual is in the news right now, and he's all over the news. And to be clear, I did not witness any crimes at that time, but it makes me uncomfortable just to think that, why was I even there? I had no business, being there, being around his sons or anything. And I'm just noticing that I used to think, okay, when I was running around in Baltimore and, there were individuals with guns and selling certain things, like that was dangerous. But now I'm able to see like, no, what you were doing in law school was also dangerous. It was just a different flavor. And you were still putting yourself in certain situations that you didn't need to be. For no reason.
Yeah. I think what's powerful about your story is the fact that oftentimes when you hear people share these types of things, you're not thinking someone who's like going to a prestigious university or someone who's, you know, at a law school or anything like that. You're not thinking of someone who grew up with a stable family structure with their mom and their
Yeah.
dad. Like, so I think that's what most certainly makes your story unique. And I know that there are a lot of people, for example, that struggle today, a lot of parents in this opioid epidemic that is not even necessarily an epidemic in like the ghettos of
No.
America. It's like suburban America. And my personal opinion is a lot of kids in the suburbs who grow up with two family households, it's a different level of trauma because they still experience abandonment and neglect in a very different way. So it may not be growing up getting jumped by the gang members, right? Like in my case, I experienced a lot of like murder and gang violence and all of these different things, but trauma doesn't discriminate, and it can sort of take forms in different ways. And for a lot of suburban kids, it's not seeing their parents because they're workaholics,
Yeah.
and it's not getting the attention from their parents, or maybe seeing their parents always arguing, and or maybe it is that divorce, right? And depression doesn't discriminate, and it's rooted in so many different things. So if you were to give advice to, let's just say, parents like yours who they had kids that grew up in a loving home in a sense, and maybe their children are struggling in adulthood, and they're caught up in, let's just say, alcoholism, or they're addicted to some kind of drugs. Like,
Yeah.
what advice would you give to, you know, and I don't want to say avoid because you can't necessarily avoid that, but if there were any advice that you would give, knowing what you know now, being on the other side of it in a sense, what advice would that be?
It's a great question. I would say lead with compassion. And so in my culture and in our culture, in our household, like mental health and mental illness were not normalized. So I know there's always these memes of like, oh, you're depressed, like go depress the dishes, like go clean or something like
Yeah.
that. And it wasn't that bad, but what I would encourage parents to do is just be a safe space for your kids. Don't assume that you know why they're acting the way that they're acting, and assume that maybe this conversation could be a matter of life or death. So let me put my ego to the side. Let me be humble and recognize maybe I don't have the answers. Maybe I need to speak with a professional that can help me. But just listen to your kid. Let them
Yeah.
talk to you. Let them open up to you.
For sure, absolutely. Now, you mentioned your journey throughout college and everything like that. Would you say that that was the lowest point in your life, or did it happen after that? Like, what was exactly like the very lowest for you, like rock bottom, before getting into the work that you do today? Like, what officially led you to ultimately getting into trauma recovery and things like that?
There's quite a few to choose from, but I would say when I left that relationship with Mr. Rapist, that was a big, very, very low point. I actually cried the most I ever cried in my life. Not my brother's near-death experience, not other things. Like, that really broke me to the core. And I was living with him in California, so I literally left. You know, I think it was like maybe Monday I decided to leave, and like the next day I'm gone. And it's a very humbling experience. You know, go to these top schools, you get good grades, you get scholarships, and then you end up living back at home with your parents, and you're struggling to eat again. You're struggling just to not have, you know, panic and a lot of PTSD, flashbacks, and things like that. And so that was a really dark time. I've definitely experienced suicide ideation in my life at different points. I've definitely engaged in self-harm. And so there was a time where I was like, if anyone knew who I was or anything that I've done, no one would want me or talk to me or things like that. And so I would say the end of 2018
Yeah.
when I had to really start over.
Wow. And a lot of your work is centered around healing. And what was it for you that led to your healing?
I think actually around that time when I started to open up to my parents. So I held on to a lot of things, but once I started to let them in on, yeah, this is kind of what I was experiencing in college, and the fact that they didn't disown me or judge me, and instead just embraced me
Sure.
and nurtured me, that was like a game changer for me because, I didn't tell them for the longest about what happened, me being raped or anything that happened in our relationship. I kept a lot of things inside, but once I had just people that I actually care and respect tell me like it's okay, it's like, oh, then maybe it's safe to start talking about these things. And once you start unleashing and breaking the secrecy, that's only going to help you to get
For sure.
support, to access resources.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. What are some of the best healing modalities you typically offer people who've kind of encountered similar things to you? So, is it just communicating with loved ones? Or are there anything in particular that comes to mind for just someone's healing journey?
I would say somatic healing is very powerful. So, especially for anyone who is a trauma survivor, or maybe it was sexual abuse or something physical, we learn not to trust our bodies. And so that might look like disassociating, that might look like self harm. But when you do somatic healing, which is like body mind connection, so breath work, for example, movement, you're able to recreate safety within you. And so some people think, and I did myself, think that therapy was just talk therapy. And the reality is that for some people, they can't even talk about these traumas because their nervous system gets
Of
hijacked.
course. Yeah,
They might panic or
yeah.
a whole bunch of symptoms. And so somatic healing really helps you to feel safe enough to even go there.
Yeah. So when you refer to semantic healing, are you like referring to sound bowls? Are you referring to like listening to some solfeggio frequencies? Like what exactly are you referring to?
I really love breath work. That's my favorite thing to recommend because it's accessible to pretty much everyone
Yeah,
and you
sure.
can do it wherever. And it's really like the body's internal way of relaxing, literally,
Yeah.
the parasympathetic
Absolutely.
nervous system. And so it's like a resource that a lot of us don't even know we have.
Absolutely.
And so
Yeah.
that's my favorite.
Yeah, a lot of people don't realize that the patterns of your breath are directly linked to your emotional state at any point in time. So just getting your breath under control. One of the techniques that I typically teach that I learned, from military training was the 4 count breath. So you sort of inhale for 4 seconds, hold your breath for 4, exhale for 4, and then hold your breath on, empty lungs for 4 seconds, and doing it 4 times just to get yourself from a sympathetic to parasympathetic. And it's something that I, oftentimes teach. So really, really great modality, and just to, like you said, calm the nervous system specifically. Any in particular, particular breath work that you have done it over the years that have worked for you?
So like the box breathing, I think that's what you.
Yep, box breathing.
Box
Yep.
breathing. That's definitely been a game changer. That's my go-to, box breathing.
Yeah, for sure. I oftentimes do it whenever I'm having a lot of anxiety or just stress, and right before meditation, it tends to work really well. Another thing is tapping. Are you familiar with tapping? Yeah, just the different meridians on the body. So that's another modality that I love, just to
Yeah.
kind of help people calm the nervous system. I had a client of mine today. She launched her very first master class, and oftentimes when I have clients that are just experiencing a lot of anxiety, I'm like, all right, let's do some box breathing, or let's do some tapping, some affirmations. Oftentimes that goes a long way. And another thing, Kriya Yoga. I'm not sure if you've heard of Kriya Yoga. A lot of breath work with that.
Okay.
And kind of like press down on one nostril, and it triggers different parts of the brain. I like geeking out about different stuff like that.
That's
So,
cool.
yeah, but no, that's amazing. And in terms of what led to you doing the work that you do now and getting certified, like, did you get inspiration from somebody else, or how in the world
Yeah, right.
did that come to be, where you just like, maybe you came across an ad and you're like, that's what I am, like, how did that end up happening?
Something similar to what you just described. So Instagram.
Yeah.
I was scrolling, and at this point I'm trying to figure out, what do I do with my life?
Yeah.
Because I very much went through the motions. So, yes, what I achieved academically, it was really hard. But in some ways, it's like I wasn't even all the way there. I was like autopilot. And it's incredible what we can accomplish even when we're not fully connected to ourselves. So once I became more connected, I was like, I don't want to practice law. I have my views already with the social justice or criminal justice system. And it was a matter of, okay, really getting back to myself, because I've been the same person since I was a little girl, like generous, community driven, etc. But how do you make that into a career?
Of course.
I knew I didn't want to be a clinician. I didn't want to treat anyone. So one day I'm just scrolling and I see on Instagram this individual who she called herself a certified trauma recovery coach, and I had never heard of that. And so I looked into it, and I thought it was a perfect fit for me because it's peer support.
For sure.
And it really would allow me to utilize my natural talent of connecting with people and my lived experiences.
For sure. I'm curious, why didn't you go and just pursue a career with your degree? Like, why didn't you take that specific path?
With the law degree? It just, I think maybe it's the borderline. Maybe it's me, Gemini, whatever it is. But it's like once I say no, I'm done. Once I decided to leave that man, I'm gone the next day. Once I decided not to drink, I've never drank again since that point. And once I said, this is not for me, then it's not for me.
Yeah, for sure.
And so I just trusted myself.
What about it wasn't for you, though?
Yeah, so for me, it was, so when you're in law school, you do different like clerkships. So I had legal experience in law school, and I got to experience it enough to know that this is so rigid. This is so slow. This is so, we need to dress a certain way, and too much ass kissing. Like, it's just not for me.
For sure.
And shout out attorneys. A lot of my father's an attorney, and my cousin, like a lot of love for attorneys, certain ones. But I just knew it wasn't compatible with me. I had lived so much of my life under autopilot, under trying to fit a mold, under trying to make other people proud. So I think a lot of it was less about the law and more about taking control of my life.
For sure. If you could have done it all over again, what would you have done differently?
I don't think I would have done anything differently. Yeah.
Why?
Because I know it's like the cliche, like everything brought me here, but it is true, So for example, back to my anxiety with men, I made my first like real best friend in law school. Shout out James. And
shout out to James.
Shout out James. And honestly, even just that alone, those 3 years was worth it, because that brought healing into my heart that, wow, I can actually meet, a platonic friend that won't ever try no weird stuff, and I really feel would accept me no matter what. And just everything happened the way it was supposed to happen. For sure. Even that relationship.
For sure. Do you ever encounter triggers now? Like, and if you can just give a rough overview to what triggers really are and how they work, because that's obviously a big part of just trauma, right? Trauma, we oftentimes say, and I learned that from Dr. Gabo Hermate, is how triggers really come from just unhealed wounds, emotional and psychological wounds that manifest later on in life, and something brushes up against that, right? And you get triggered, and you may not even experience that trigger, and later on in life it just hits you out of nowhere, and you're like, where the hell did that come from? Not realizing there's still some unresolved trauma there. So do you still get triggered? And what would you say is the best description of a trigger outside of what I just said? Yeah.
And that was a great description. So a trigger, I know colloquially it's used often, like, oh, this triggered me. But a true trigger is tied to PTSD, where it could be a smell, it could be a sound, it could be somebody that looks like someone that harmed you. But it pretty much, it's like a little passport that allows you to travel back involuntarily to a really traumatic experience. And I've experienced those throughout my life without knowing what they were. So I can recall, for example, when I was 15, I was observing a man, elderly man with who I presume to be his granddaughter, and I just created this narrative. I didn't like how he was moving. I didn't like how close he was.
Yeah.
I didn't like it. And so I already decided this man's a pedophile and I don't fuck with him. And so when he tried to help me get into like a taxi later on, I completely was like disgusted. Like,
for
this
sure.
man didn't do anything to me.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But that's an example where it's very subconscious sometimes, and it's like your body is remembering,
Yeah.
and your body is telling you you're not safe,
Yeah.
so you need to take action.
For sure, for sure. I remember hearing about this concept. They call it intuitive repulsion. It's like that gut feeling, and the gut is like your second brain, as
is,
you
yeah.
oftentimes hear. So whenever you do get that trigger, or maybe that gut feeling like something is not right here, sometimes it is valuable to sort of follow that, right? Because someone, it's like, they say just their vibe is off, or whatever the case may be, but there may be some truth to that. But it is important to obviously just analyze like where that trigger is coming from. I think that's something that we don't really oftentimes teach, like taking time, like why did I feel the way that I felt? Like, why am I feeling the way that I felt? Like, I remember just early on in life, even feelings of jealousy, like, what the hell, like jealousy out of all things. And I realized that it wasn't jealousy in like an insecure jealousy. It was an abandonment jealousy, like having or seeing my mom choose other men over me, and I was her son.
Yeah.
Right. And those things, sort of become those unhealed wounds that lead to the triggers of jealousy years later. Right. Because in my mind, I'm like, I'm Josh Valentin. What the hell am I getting? Like,
Yeah,
I don't
yeah.
look at myself as less than anyone. Right. So there would be moments where I just like question, like, where the hell is this coming from? Or it would be situations of just abandonment, right? And having someone like feeling like I'd be very protective over even business relationships, feeling like I'm going to be screwed over, right, in business. And a lot of that was deeply rooted in abandonment or neglect and things like that. So it's interesting how triggers sort of manifest themselves years later in all kinds of ways.
Definitely.
Yeah.
It's like those, the messaging, it will
Yeah.
keep circulating until you correct it. And so I can definitely relate to abandonment and things like that. As far as them happening to this day, they do happen, but very infrequently.
Yeah.
But I can definitely recall, what was an example? For example, this, I forgot what he did, but he came to do something in the house and he used my bathroom and he moved some of my things and I felt very violated.
Yeah.
It's not that deep. I know to a lot of
Yeah,
people,
yeah.
but
Yep.
that set me back. I was
Yeah.
like, I said a lot of things. But it just, I felt in that moment that I was a little girl again. And it's like, don't touch my
Sure.
things.
Yeah. No, it's interesting. One of the things that I've been studying a lot lately as well is just people being toxic. Like, what does that look like? Toxicity. And it's interesting because we all have a little bit of toxic
Yeah.
tendencies in us. And what would you say are some of the toxic tendencies that you revert to or revert back
Yeah.
to from time to time, and you have to catch yourself? Because I know I'm most certainly like, all right, Josh, you're being a little toxic right now. That was a little petty.
Okay.
Like those petty moments or
Okay.
moments like for me, my controlling ways. And it's interesting, right? Because not to go down the rabbit hole here, but when it comes to toxicity, there are a lot of toxic tendencies that also have a benefit in areas
Yeah.
that serve you really well. So, for example, you think of someone like a Steve Jobs or an Elon Musk, right? High performing entrepreneurs, highly successful and accomplished in terms of their work, maybe not necessarily the best husbands per se, right? But in their workplace, it actually helps in terms of like for them being controlling or just
Yeah.
being super aggressive and they're sort of rewarded for this behavior. But in the relationship, world, like, you know, people, they struggle. They struggle as fathers, they struggle as husbands, they struggle as leaders, because a lot of people just feel like they're tyrants in a sense. So it's interesting, this dichotomy of, on one side of the spectrum, you have toxic tendencies that can sort of sabotage your relationships, but on the other side, you're being rewarded as an entrepreneur that's
Yeah.
hard charging and who's highly successful because of those very toxic tendencies. What do you think about that?
I
I know
love
that
it.
was an earful.
No, I took it
Yeah.
all in, you know, because context matters. And so, literally, what you were describing was my father, where, and he says this exact same thing.
Yeah.
Because I tell him, you have a lot of trauma.
Yeah, yeah,
Like, you have a lot of trauma. And your nervous system is highly dysregulated, respectfully. And he said, you know, I've used it to my benefit.
Yeah.
So he's a high level
Absolutely.
businessman. And so and that's something I love about my father. He's fearless.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter who's around, who he's talking to, you're gonna respect me. And I love that.
Yeah.
And so that's literally what he does.
Isn't that interesting?
It is.
It's crazy. And like, do you strip the man of his toxic tendencies? Do you channel it? Right? I believe in the idea of channeling it, right?
Yeah.
And we oftentimes refer to it as our dark side. If you read the book, I believe it's by Tim Grover, the book Winning, and he has another book called Relentless. He was the coach of Michael Jordan and also Mamba, Kobe Bryant. And Kobe Bryant often referred to the dark side, and that was the
Okay.
whole Mamba mentality.
Got you.
But it's taking your dark side and channeling it to something that's actually constructive. When you think of the gentleman archetype, for example, when you think of gentlemen, they oftentimes in Hollywood have an assassin simultaneously be a gentleman. And the idea is, the gentleman has this dark nature, and he sort of puts on this suit as armor to protect himself against himself. But when it's time to kick ass and take names, he can channel it into his work and have a lot of success with exactly what it is. So it's the idea of being, like Jordan Peterson would say, being a monster, allowing, if you have a young boy, allowing that young boy to grow into a monster, but simultaneously learn how to tame that monster, to channel that dark energy in a sense. And as toxic as hell as that may sound, it sounds like super toxic, but if you stripped a Steve Jobs, an Elon Musk, your dad, of that very nature, would they truly succeed, right? At the level they succeed at, would they even be the men that we know them to be if it weren't for that dynamic?
Yeah. So I'm of the mindset that if you're human, you're flawed.
Yeah.
You're there. I definitely have dark energy. I definitely have very much a Gemini. You know, I'm this and I'm that.
Sure.
And what I would say to that is, again, context is important, time and place. So I love that my dad is so intense and ambitious, but leave that at work. You don't need to bring
right.
it to your kids,
Yeah.
hypothetically. Things like that. And I'm very, so going back to the original question of like, what's my toxic traits? So I would definitely say I'm my father's twin. So I'm naturally very calm like my mom, but under certain circumstances, I go feral. So I would say that presently my toxic, when I revert back, it's that black and white thinking again, that very protective. So the last time I saw it a little bit was when some relatives were disrespectful towards my brother. That's like my number one. Don't ever do that. Like this. You can say whatever you want to me, but don't ever disrespect my brother. And I reacted a bit. But I'm okay with that. I honor that part of myself that is protective. I think it's okay that we have different sides of ourselves, but be aware of what that looks like.
Of course.
You know, to what degree how far do you take it?
Of course.
And things like that.
Yeah, no, it's so good. You mentioned being a Gemini. I'm a Libra, and it's funny, sometimes when I'm giving speeches on entrepreneurship, I ask the audience, which version do you want? And I'll have a photo. One is like me meditating, and then one of me is like on stage going crazy. And I say, which do you want, the saint or the savage? Right? The saint, and 10 out of 10 times they're gonna say the savage. And it's crazy how people they're naturally compelled to like that dark energy as well. It's like there's this book, it was like really popular at one point, The Way of the Superior Man.
Okay.
And what it mentions is that the feminine counterpart, if you ever see a cockroach like on a crawling on a wall, and your feminine counterpart gets all freaked out, you always kill the damn roach as the masculine person. You always kill the roach, because the author explains how women at a very deeply unconscious level want a killer. They want to know that if
Accurate.
women want a killer, why is that? Because they want to know if someone is coming into the tribe to rape and kill their children, they want to know that they're with a man that has the capacity to kill if need be. So it's very instinctual, right? It's very biological to want a not only a provider but a protector.
Yeah.
So if you're like this wimpy dude that's also getting, oh my gosh, like a mouse or a roach, it actually the woman loses respect in a sense. I mean, would you agree with that at all? Like just seeing a man or not willing to like kill the bug because they're afraid as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, I found that quite interesting, right? And I oftentimes tell men, yeah, if you see a bug and your lady's freak, kill the damn bug, right? Because it's just, there's something about a human being's natural inclination to be drawn to the dark side. And from a very spiritual, esoteric standpoint, I do believe in the idea of non-duality. I believe here on the third dimension, there's just no escaping the fact that we have the dark and we have the light. And just like the yin-yang symbol, if you look at the dark part of the yin-yang symbol, you also see that little white spot, and on the light part you see the little dark spot, because you could very well have someone, let's just say, who embodies the light, but it can be a false light. You understand? It can be a light where now they feel as if they're better than, right? You could very well be so righteous or so self-righteous and everything like that, and now you don't even have the capacity to go and help others, right? Because you're so high vibrational in a sense. Have you experienced that with some people?
Absolutely. Just to be frank, I've seen it with not all, but with some religious folk.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Where I'm like, okay, you can be here all day praying, but when's the last time you broke bread with someone that doesn't look like you?
That's right.
I think of my family, for example, someone that came to work on our home but came to become a family friend. He opened up to us, and I don't think he'll ever, no one will ever know who I'm talking about, but he was involved with organized crime in Mexico, and he committed a lot of crimes. And he shares some of them with my family. I still hugged him the same. We still ate food together. We had Thanksgiving. Like, it's not my place to judge you. But I've seen that a lot with other, sometimes religious, sometimes not,
For sure.
where it's like, I like, I'm better than you, or...
Of course.
So I don't know.
I definitely resonate with the idea, if you're talking from a Christian context, Jesus was the friend of sinners.
Yeah.
He went into the dark and sort of penetrated the dragon skin, if you will, and found broken people who were lost, people who were deeply rooted in sin. And it's like, if you're truly going to be a person of service, right? Think about it. It's, the dark, if there were no dark, would you even be useful in the marketplace?
No.
Would you even have any value if there was no people to reach? So I just believe that this is part of the human experience, right? To find people who are broken, find people who are lost, and not to come from a place of just being so self-righteous and holier than thou, but coming from a place of, I've been there before and I can relate. And I've found my way out of it, and I'm coming back for you. I'm coming back to help you. right? And I believe that that is the true work of a light worker, someone who's here on this planet to experience the human experience, right? And all of its shit, because it's a lot, and to heal, to transform, and then take all that you've learned, take that elixir, circle around the hero's journey, and then come back to offer it back to the people. And it's so beautiful that you're in this line of work now, and I'm curious what's next, because you have your Cycle Breakers Club, and you have your coaching practice, of course. You have your public speaking, and you also have a book coming out. So maybe you can shed a little bit of light on the book and why should people purchase the book.
Yeah, and I want to give you a special shout out because you are my coach, and writing this book has been very challenging for me because I shared briefly on some experiences that I've had. It's different when you have to sit down and really sit with it and see it on paper.
Of course.
And so being part of your mastermind where it's like, okay, this is the deadline, you need to get it done, has really helped me. So that deadline is coming up, and I'm really excited to get that first draft done. And people should read it because it's like, not my diary, but kind of, where I'm allowing you to get a really in-depth view of what I've experienced. And why should you care what I've experienced? Because they're very universal experiences.
For sure.
Betrayal, pain, abuse, things like that. And I give a framework that you can follow to start to do the healing work.
Nice. I love that. And in terms of your work with the Cycle Breakers Club and building community now, like what's the long-term vision for you and your work specifically?
Mine is really building a brand. So the Cycle Breakers Club, I want to see. So next year, I'm already starting to build like a online community where it's like we're cycle breakers, and I want that to include digital products, different group meetings. I definitely want to scale my coaching and just keep taking it to the next level. Apart from coaching, I'm a keynote speaker. So ironically, I'm actually planning to go to Baltimore at least twice in the coming months to go speak.
Nice.
And so I just want to keep speaking.
That's beautiful.
More stages.
Of course. Yeah, absolutely. If you can give a one-page manifesto for someone, let's just say this was the very last document. You don't get to leave the book, but maybe your very best ideas on one page that gives people a breakdown of maybe they've experienced deep trauma, and you have to give sort of a one-page manifesto on how they can break that cycle, the generational cycle, or whatever the case may be, heal, and ultimately transform. What would you put on that one page? What would be maybe a framework or a few modalities or just something that they can implement, very simple, very concise, that they can take and say, okay, if I do this, this, and this, then I may not be completely healed, but I'll at least start the journey, or I'll be at least a lot better than I was.
That's a great question. So for me, it really comes down to mindset. And so that's the main thing that I focus on with my clients is what is your internal dialogue like? What are you telling yourself day in and day out? And my whole philosophy is that no one is born empty-handed. So you grew up, you said, in the hood. I grew up mostly in the suburbs. But regardless of our financial circumstances, we both were born in this world with an inheritance, an ancestral inheritance of traumas and generational gifts. And so what I wish I knew earlier is that I have the agency to leverage those gifts and also disinherit those traumas. And so when it comes to leveraging and also disinheriting, I would say first get curious with yourself, because truly we are the most permanent person in our life. So the relationship that we have with ourselves is the most important.
Of course.
So how well do you know yourself? What have you observed about your behavior, about your thought processes that you want to start going into?
Absolutely.
And then I would say find your community, find your people. It can be online, it can be in person, it can be religious affiliation, whatever that is for you, but you're not meant to do this alone. You're meant to have someone or some people on your side.
Yeah, yeah. No,
And
that's
I would
so
say those are like the two first steps.
that's so good. Absolutely. Now, in terms of just where can people reach you if someone wants to work with you at a coaching capacity, or maybe they want to book you as a speaker or anything like that? Where's the best place to find you?
PriscillaMaria.com.
Love it. Awesome.
Yes.
And what about Instagram?
Cycle Breaker Coach.
Nice. Cycle Breaker Coach. Awesome. Love it. And outside of that, if there were any departing words that you can share, if this was your very last interview, what would you share with the world?
I would say that I am just as flawed as anyone else. So a lot of people come to me for advice and guidance, and I tell them I'm not a saint. I'm not healed. I am healing. I am becoming. But if I can make it to the other side of darkness, then so can you. If my brother can make it from living the life he was living to now being back to himself and having a job now, and it's like,
Wow.
who is this man? Yeah.
Amazing.
You know, his testimony is something
He's back
else.
At work.
Yes.
I love that.
It's been a scary time, a lot of scary times with him.
That's incredible, though.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. And we'll obviously be rooting him on and looking
appreciate
forward to
that.
hearing more about that. I'm sure we're going to have plenty of conversations as, the months go by, the years go by. So really excited to bring you back on the show, of course.
Thank you.
And any last words that you would like to share before we wrap up? Anything else that comes to mind?
I think just doing this is really healing.
Yeah.
Just having this safe space.
It really is, yeah.
Some things that kind of came up for me. So, for example, like two things. When you mentioned about how some people might get to a point where they feel too righteous to help people, but really we're all the same.
That's right.
I've always believed that, but one instance where that became really apparent was when I went to volunteer at a prison in Michigan for women. And I was surprised that they here's a little alert thing, like alarm, and then go for it. So I was like, all right, I guess I'm in prison. And I went there to facilitate a domestic violence support group. And I met a lot of amazing, beautiful women. And I saw myself in them. I'm like, I was told by a therapist that I was going to end up in jail because of some of my behaviors.
Yeah.
And I could very much see that. Majority of them were abused, had been through so many things that one day, hey, one of them may have ended the life of their abuser. And who am I to judge that?
That's right.
And so I encourage people, don't ever feel like you're on a high horse. I never feel like I'm above homelessness, that I'm above death or addiction.
For sure.
I always see myself as the same as other people. So please just take some $5, $10, buy somebody some food. Just do something kind, especially in this day and age.
Absolutely.
And then going back to the toxic behaviors, I think one thing I haven't really talked as much as I would like to is about my behaviors in that relationship. Because for the longest time, I thought I'm an abuser. Like, what the hell's wrong with me?
Yeah.
And I take ownership for everything that I did and said. But I also understand why I was doing it now. So for those who are in a toxic or domestic violence situation, look into reactive abuse, because that's a tactic that abusers use as well, where they'll be like, oh, see, look at you, like, you're the one popping off, you're the one doing this, but tell the whole story.
Yeah.
Why are they popping off? Like, what did you do?
Absolutely.
But that's something maybe I'll elaborate more in the book.
Oh,
but
yeah.
I'm certainly
Yeah.
not a saint.
Absolutely. And would love to go deeper into even more of that. But I love that. That was such a great way to bring this plane in for a landing here. And thank you so much for being on the show, Priscilla. It's, such a beautiful episode. And I'm sure our audience will definitely be able to get a tremendous amount of value. So appreciate you. And hopefully we get you back pretty soon. So
Thank you. It's an honor.
definitely. So that is a wrap, guys. Hope you all enjoyed today's episode. And be sure to like, comment, subscribe. Make sure you follow Coach Priscilla, of course, and all of our social media and all that good stuff. So we'll be seeing you on the next episode. Take care. God bless.